Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the final installment of our discussions on climate change. This is the video associated with Chapter 4 of Weird Weather by Kate Evans. So far, what have you found in your research as you have fact-checked the 2006 data that Kate Evans had to work with against what's available to us now, nearly more than 20 years later? So first of all, how much have you found that the average global temperature has risen since 2006? She stated in the book, if you remember, that it was 0.8 degrees Celsius in 2006. And at this point today, it's somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 already. We have somewhat differing estimates because the last few years have been so much hotter than anyone anticipated. And so scientists are waiting to see whether or not this pattern holds. So whether this is in fact an average or not. But different scientists, everyone's putting it at least 1.2, and some scientists are putting it as high as 1.5 already as the global average temperature, which is not quite double what it was in 2006, but it's almost there. So we have seen a massive increase in global annual temperature, average temperature around the world in a short period of time. So how much are temperatures likely to rise by 2050? We are definitely on track within 2050 to see 2 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature that the IPCC and the other United Nations organizations have said is the outside limit of what we can allow the Earth to warm to and still have somewhat normal circumstances that can sustain life on this planet. Once we get past those temperatures, we start to get into the tipping points that will undermine all of the normal processes that maintain our weather and our ecosystems and our food supplies and our water supplies. So we are already on track to get to 2 degrees Celsius and potentially past that by 2050, depending on what we do in the next few years. So if you look at what was necessary to do in 2006 towards the climate goal and where we have gotten since then, we have not gotten very far in terms of international legislation or in terms of, in the United States, domestic efforts to control our carbon and methane emissions. But what we have accomplished in that time frame is to have a whole host of new innovative technologies that make solar and wind much cheaper than they were in 2006. And we've now seen a reversal of expense such that renewable energy like solar and wind power is now cheaper than coal as a source of electricity, which was not true in 2006. So we have made technological progress. What we have not made is progress in actually reducing our carbon emissions or reducing our methane emissions as a globe. Individual countries have made great strides towards that. The United States is not one of them. And since we are one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and along with China, then it is worrisome, to say the least, that these two countries have not made progress in reducing their emissions. So I'm interested to see your homework and find out what other things you fact-checked. But overall, you'll probably notice a pattern, which is that things are much worse. They've gotten much more dire than they were in 2006. And that wasn't that long ago. In fact, some of you were probably born around that time. So just in your lifetime, the climate crisis has escalated drastically. Okay, so we have this big problem. What do we do as humans? What are our actual solutions? We know that we have not made a lot of progress on getting everybody to agree to what they need to agree to, and putting the solutions in place internationally that are necessary. So then what do we do right now, given where we're at with this situation? So last time I showed you this interesting comparison of what it is to, over the lifetime of an estimated US resident, what our carbon emissions are like compared to that of an unhoused person, compared to that of the average human around the world, even with our numbers in the United States taken in. And you can see your average person, you and me in the United States, consumes much, much, much more and puts out much more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than other humans around the planet. And so it would make sense for us to change our habits, right, in order to be able to fix this problem. So what things could we do to reduce our carbon emissions and our methane emissions as Americans, given that we are the biggest individual per capita emitters of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere? So here's a set of possibilities to consider in terms of individual change that we could make for our consumption patterns. So what about recycling? Recycling plastic, metal, glass. How good is recycling? We have been told over and over again that recycling is necessary. It's what good people do. It's what we should be putting our efforts into. You've probably heard that since you were a little kid. The reality is, though, that today there's almost no market for recycled plastics and very little market for recycled glass. There's some market for recycled aluminum, but plastic is basically non-recyclable at this point, largely because it is cheaper to take fresh oil and make more plastic than it is to recycle old plastic. So although China used to take our recyclables and make them into new things from the United States, that's no longer the case. So we don't really have anywhere to sell our plastics to. So you might put your recyclables into the recycling bin, but very little of that actually gets recycled. Most of it just ends up going right to the incinerator and going with all the rest of the trash out there. So recycling does very little good because recycling is not currently economically viable in the world that we live in. So cross that one out. What about buying secondhand clothes and furniture, appliances, things like that instead of new? Yes, that's an excellent thing to do, definitely. Secondhand. If you only go to thrift stores and only buy secondhand on Facebook Marketplace or someplace like that, you will make some impact on your carbon emissions. And that's a great thing to do. It's not one of the most important, though, if you're comparing it to the rest of the things on this list. How about composting food waste? Much of the methane that's in the atmosphere, as we've already talked about, comes from agriculture in the form of beef and dairy and lamb, also in the form of rice production. So those are major sources of methane, but there's another major source of methane, and that is, as I mentioned earlier, the rot that comes out of landfills. So when you throw things away and you trash them in a way that they're not able to be composted, they then start to emit methane as they decompose unnaturally in the landfill. That smell from the landfill is actually methane. So if you compost your food, you put it into the green bins that many cities have, and that then gets properly mixed into the earth so that it decomposes in a natural way, you can offset your methane emissions. It's a good way, definitely. How about this one? Reducing air travel. No longer traveling by jet fuel, but instead traveling on trains or buses. This can be a major contribution that you could make to reducing your own carbon footprint in the world, not flying. How about turning the lights off when you leave a room? That's a nice thing to do, but it's not huge in the scheme of things. What about eating only food that's grown locally rather than food that's shipped from far away. I heard an interesting statistic that in Florida, they sell orange juice that is with California oranges, and in California, they sell orange juice that has Florida oranges in it, and we ship them back and forth because they seem a little bit more exotic, therefore a little bit more uh, interesting, and they can get a little bit more money out of them. And in general, much of our food is shipped around the world. It's shipped across borders. A lot of our food comes in from Mexico. Um, if you choose to only buy food that was produced locally in California and even more closer in within the general greater Los Angeles area, you will do a great deal to reduce your carbon emissions. And your methane emissions as well. So this is something that is really quite useful if you can shop at farmers markets or get involved with co-ops that bring food boxes once a week and directly support local farmers, then you will actually do quite a bit to reduce your own personal greenhouse gas emissions. The next one, is probably the biggest thing you could possibly do, which is to stop driving your car. Instead, to take the bus, to ride a bike, ride an e-bike if you can afford one, or to walk. Driving cars is one of the most individually worst things that we do as Americans, and particularly as Angelenos, to contribute to carbon emissions. So if you're serious about changing what you do to cause climate change, then shifting away from a car and instead into public transportation or a bike, that will be the biggest thing you could do. The next biggest is probably this, which is to eat less beef and dairy, milk and cheese and ice cream and all those good things that have dairy in them. Instead, shift to dairy products that are using milks other than cow milk. The milks that we've talked about already, oat milk or rice milk or soy milk or almond milk, cashew milk, all of those things. Cashews in particular can make good cheeses. So there are alternatives. But if you cut out the red meat, lamb, and the beef, particularly the beef, from your diet, or if you get it directly from a farmer, or you get it locally so that it is not finished off with corn, you can do a great deal to reduce your personal methane emissions, methane being the more potent of the two greenhouse gases that we've been considering. How about unplugging appliances? Nice thing to do, like turning off the light, but it's not a massive thing. So you'll notice that she focuses on this a lot in the book, but ultimately it won't have that huge of an impact. What would have a really big impact is not just unplugging appliances, but changing the temperature in your house, not using a ton of AC or a lot of heater, and particularly AC. Those are the reasons why the United States in particular has so much higher energy consumption than other countries around the world, is we have these massive spaces that we control the temperature through AC, and those controlled temperatures cost a lot in the form of energy and therefore carbon emissions. Last but not least, go vegan, entirely give up all forms of animal products. That obviously would do more than just eating less beef and lamb and dairy. So if you are up to it, then going vegan is definitely something that would make a major dent in your carbon emissions. Of the things that are here, probably going vegan and stopping driving a car, driving a car being the first of those, would be the top two. And right after that would be eating locally. Those would be the three that are the most. I'd say stop driving a car, going vegan, eating local food, and right after that would be lowering your AC, not having it blasting quite so much, and reducing your air travel. Okay, so we've gone through that list of things that we can do individually, and you'll notice in the book she's really focused on having us do individual things to change this and address climate change. But if you pause for a minute and think about it, is that really where we should be focusing our attention and our energy, is on unplugging our appliances and walking to the grocery store and making sure we're not buying plastic and riding our bikes instead of our cars and taking the bus and never taking an airplane and going vegan. Like, is that really the solution to the Earth's problem? And the answer is it's only a tiny partial solution. If you think about who really pumps out the carbon emissions and the methane emissions, it's not you and me so much. It's not everyday people like us. The wealthiest people produce the most in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see in both of these two diagrams how much more a person who's in a household $150,000 or a year or more emits than a person who's at 50,000, a household that's at 50,000. And if you get up to the level of a household of $1 million or more as their annual income, their greenhouse gas emissions are way, way higher. So the amount of greenhouse gas emissions at the very top would need to be controlled in order to address the emissions problem, much more so than that at the bottom, people like you and me. But even if we were to get wealthy people to reduce the size of their houses so that they're not blasting AC in 10,000 square foot houses, and to stop going around on their private jets so much, et cetera, et cetera. You can make the list of things that if, say, we were successful at getting wealthy people to rein in their greenhouse gas emissions, would that be sufficient? And the answer is still no, it's not, because individual solutions to this problem can never address the totality of what is actually happening, which is largely about the industrial and corporate sectors. So the rest of the country, not our at home, whether we're wealthy and living in a mansion or we are living in a tiny one bedroom studio apartment, that sector of the economy is not the thing that is pumping out the most in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in terms of carbon dioxide. Instead, it's the business sector, it's the industrial sector. So we need to focus our energy and efforts there rather than on changing our individual habits if we want to solve this problem. Because we can ride our bikes and shop at the farmer's market as much as we want, but if the big companies are still consuming as much energy as they are currently, our efforts will never offset the strength of what they are doing. So here's some examples of that. Bitcoin, for example, is famous for its energy consumption. So too are all cryptocurrencies, but Bitcoin in particular, because it's one of the most popular. So as you can see from this graph here, Bitcoin in 2021 consumed about as much energy as countries like Sweden, Ukraine, Norway, Argentina, so similar quantities, and half as much as the entire country of the United Kingdom, one of the wealthiest and least good at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So Bitcoin, just Bitcoin alone, is consuming energy as if it were an entire country right now. So individual people within those countries can chip away at their own greenhouse gas emissions as much as they want, but if they don't have a shared solution to something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency more generally, then nothing's going to change in terms of the climate crisis. Here's another example. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are neck and neck with AI in terms of energy consumption. AI wants massive amounts of energy in order to be able to test and establish a basic model and then continue to test it and re-release new models of things like ChatGPT or Copilot, etc., all of the varieties of AI that are out there. So you can see here contrasting a single flight. So you can go ahead and reduce your flights right here, but here is what the stats actually say. A single flight from San Francisco to New York versus the average human life's energy consumption and CO2 output within 1 year. So the average human CO2 output versus the average American's CO2 output in a year versus the entire life cycle of average US car and its carbon footprint versus a single test to establish an AI model. You can see the contrast that, okay, we could never drive a car individually, but if we're using AI and if everyone's using AI and if AI is taking over everything, AI is consuming so much energy that those individual instances of reducing carbon emissions have really no import. Okay, so if your individual changes are nice, they might feel good, they might be important to, being a responsible part of the solution to climate change, but they're insufficient and they cannot solve the solution on their own, individual responses, then what do we need to do? What really would your efforts be better used to do than to recycle, to turn things off, to go to the farmer's market? How could you better use your time? The answer is getting politically active, because since we need a shared solution, we only have one way to accomplish that, and that is through the legislative process. So we need our legislators, that is at the city level, that is at the state level, that is at the federal level, all the way up to the international level. We need those people that represent us and that make policy decisions on our behalf to create systems that will rein in carbon emissions and methane emissions and help us to stave off the crisis of 2 degrees Celsius that is looming before us in 2050. So we have to get politicians to do something about this, and politicians will not do anything about it if they are not pushed to by their constituency. So you, as a person who lives in this country, can better use your time by joining forces with other people who are organizing to get politicians to do the right things. So that is the place to put your energy. It's nice to go to the farmer's market, go ahead and do that. It's nice to ride your bike, go ahead and do that. But if you really care about stopping climate change, you will get involved with groups that are targeting the political process to change the legislative outcomes in order to be able to manage the overall system in which Bitcoin and ChatGPT and Exxon Oil all operate. So one of the big problems with being able to accomplish that is the moment that we're in right now. So we are going to be talking about these terms more in the unit ahead of us on globalization and on the divide between wealthy and poor countries. But I want you to start to think about this now in relationship to climate change as well. So there are two main contrasting theories of how the government ought to work, a democratic government ought to work. One of them I'll call social democracy or democratic socialism. It's both a political model and an economic model. And it's associated with the economist John Maynard Keynes, who helped establish the political and economic solution to the Great Depression. He was a British economist, but his ideas really influenced the Great New Deal here in the United States, the New Deal after the Great Depression in the end of the 1930s and into the 1940s. And John Maynard Keynes's model favors public interests, shared goods as an outcome, so the things that we all need together. And it advocates for high levels of government regulation and oversight of the economy. It also advocates for high levels of government spending on infrastructure, services, and the oversight of those infrastructures and services. So it's a model that wants to see a shared approach to solving shared problems. Now, by contrast, on the other hand, we have a model that we can call neoliberal capitalism. So social democracy, which is also capitalistic, it really it ruled the roost as an economic and political model from the 1930s until about the 1970s, almost into the 1980s. So we'll say the 1980s for our purposes. So the 1930s to the 1980s. So 50 years of this model of social democracy that continues to be the dominant model in a lot of the countries that we've discussed as being as doing really well on many measures, such as the Nordic countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway. And it is a model that is still, to some extent, operating here in the United States and the United Kingdom as well, but has been rolled back since the 1980s. Now, neoliberal capitalism really took hold as a political model in the 1980s, and it's associated with two economists, Friedrich Hayek, but particularly Milton Friedman, who was the one who popularized Hayek's ideas in the 1970s and put them into place as policy in the 1980s and onwards. So in contrast to social democracy, neoliberal capitalism favors business interests over public interests. So it doesn't ask, what does the public need and how can we serve that? Instead, what it asks is, what does the business sector want and how can we serve those interests? How can we serve the interests of capital? It advocates, in order to achieve that, low levels of government regulation and oversight, because it says, okay, the business sector doesn't like regulation, and the business sector is what is good for us because it's what drives the economy. Therefore, we should not have regulation on the business sector. It also advocates for low levels of government spending on infrastructure, services, and oversight. It says, not only should there be low levels of regulation, but the government also shouldn't be involved in things like schooling. It shouldn't be involved in pretty much anything but the bare minimum, like policing. That's basically in a pure form of neoliberal capitalism. That is what the theorists advocate, is that basically only policing and the military are what the government should be doing, and everything else, building anything, providing any services, should be left up to the business sector rather than the government. So we have two contrasting models. We're going to talk more about these going forward, but one of them is really dominant today, and that's neoliberal capitalism, particularly in the United States, where we have seen decreased government regulation, particularly recently, and we have seen lower and lower levels of government spending on infrastructure and services. So in this particular moment that we're in, it's difficult to advocate for the regulation that's necessary to bring the business sector into compliance with what we need for addressing climate change. So we're at a particular paradox where at the very moment that we need the most in terms of intervention from the political intervention to be able to solve the shared problem of climate change, it's also the very moment that we have the lowest appetite for government regulation, and we are in fact rolling back government regulation rather than starting to make more and give more teeth to the regulation that does exist. So hold on to these words going forward and understand how they relate to climate change, because neoliberal capitalism really is like pouring gasoline on the fire of climate change. All right, but let's imagine that we did live in a different political moment and that we had the wherewithal to be able to put in place the policies we needed to check the progress of global warming and the climate change that it causes. What would we want if we could put those policies in place? First and foremost, we would need to stop extracting any more oil and natural gas from underground. So just cap all of that and not pull it out anymore. That would be the most important thing that we could do for solving our climate crisis and starting to make progress towards offsetting the climate change that we're already experiencing. That would be number one. Number two would be to end all coal-fired power plants. I showed you other slides about how much coal consumption goes on, particularly in China, but also here in the United States. All countries that are using coal-fired power plants need to stop that right away and shift over to other energy supplies, because coal puts up so much more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than other forms of energy production. Next up, after we stop extracting more oil, again, there's tons of above ground oil that's already been extracted that can be used. But if we stop extracting any more oil, we shut down the coal power plants. The next important thing to do would be to switch all of our transportation away from gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. So we would shift to an all-electric fleet of transportation, and that would, in many cases, need to be public transit, putting in light rail and similar systems, streetcars that could address public transit needs. After that, the most important thing we really could do is stop cutting down our forests. Our forests are our major way of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. They sequester carbon. And if we are going to be able to address the existing problems we already have with climate change, we need those forests to be able to continue to pull out carbon from the atmosphere. And we cannot easily replenish them once they die out, because forests are complicated biological like superorganisms that once they die, getting them to restart and come back to life is a complicated process because they are so complex. So we need to stop cutting down our forests, and where we do have forests, we need to help them to start to grow and to expand rather than cutting them down. Next off, we would need to switch all of the cold countries away from oil-heated homes. You may have a home that is heated with oil. It's a little bit less likely, though, because here in Southern California, that's not typical. But in places like the Northeast, Massachusetts, or in much of Europe, people have large oil tanks that they fill, and they use that, they burn it in their house, they use that to heat their homes all winter long. It's very common on the the East Coast and in Europe, and that needs to change. We need to get those kinds of buildings off of oil and into things like geothermal and heat pumps that can regulate the temperature in innovative ways that are not reliant on burning fossil fuels. Then, to address our methane problems, some of the things we need to do particularly is to rein in our beef production, and with that dairy, of course, but also rice production. If you think about the numbers of countries in the world that use huge quantities of rice, India, for example, China, Japan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, there are many countries that consume vast quantities of rice. We need to get humans away from rice and onto crops that require far less water and therefore produce far less methane when they're planted. Rice is particularly methane heavy, so we need to stop so much rice production, and we need to stop our beef production, or at least the way that we are producing beef currently. There are more sustainable ways we could produce it in the future. And we need to start to divert our food waste away from landfills and instead compost it so that we can stop the methane off-gassing that comes from landfills. So these are some policies that we could put into place if we had the political wherewithal to be able to do it. These would be the things that would be top of the list in terms of solving the climate crisis. Okay, so you might be thinking, wow, those sound like not very fun. Like rice, I like rice, and I like beef, and I like flying in a jet plane to go and see people or go and see new places. None of this sounds great. I don't really want to live in this world. And some people have actually said, well, let's find something else to do to offset global warming instead of solving the carbon emission problem. And so let's look at some of their solutions. One of the things that's been proposed is that we start to do unnatural carbon sequestration. So, as I've mentioned and as you've read in the book, trees pull carbon out of the atmosphere, kelp in the oceans pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, phytoplankton pull carbon out of the atmosphere. They sequester it, they keep it on Earth or in the water through natural processes. But some humans have said, and in fact, Bill Gates has funded people to create technology to do this. They have proposed that we put machines in the air that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, pull it together, and pump it down under either the ocean or under land. Others have suggested that we just capture it at the point that it is produced, as you can see in this diagram here. Capture carbon at the point in which it's produced at a, like say, a coal-powered a coal power plant, and pull it down and pump it under the earth instead of allowing it to go into the atmosphere where it can cause more global warming. So there's been a suggestion that we start to store unnaturally carbon underground or even under the ocean. The problem with carbon sequestration is it doesn't address all of the many other ways in which carbon's getting produced, particularly through fires, the many forest fires we're having now, or droughts that are killing vegetation, or etc. It's not a long-term solution to the climate crisis as we're now experiencing it. It might be a partial solution, but there are all sorts of worries about if you were to, for example, put large quantities of carbon under the ocean. Not only would that acidify the ocean from underneath, because that, as we know, carbon interacts with the ocean and turns it sort of fizzy. Not only would that potentially happen, but if it were to erupt back out of the ocean and head into the atmosphere, we'd get this immediate global warming problem where we would have temperature spikes that would devastate our ecology. So it's a dangerous proposition. Putting it under land also has that same problem of what if it escapes and heads back into the atmosphere in some way. It doesn't solve the problem, it just sort of pushes the problem around. But potentially safer forms of carbon sequestration will be proposed going forward. At present, it is an ongoing concern and potentially dangerous depending on where and how the carbon is sequestered. But also, if we're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere specifically, rather than just capturing carbon at the point of production, if we're pulling it out of the atmosphere, like a Bill Gates funded company is currently doing, the energy required to do that is its own problem, right? If what we're needing in part is energy reduction rather than increased energy. So solving a problem of energy production with higher demands for energy is a little bit backwards. Something else that has been proposed to solve our and this is mentioned a little bit in the book, but to solve our global warming problems, other than reducing our carbon emissions, right? So, okay, let's just let people continue to produce carbon as they are right now. Let's not change that in any way. Instead, let's modify our atmosphere in order for it to reflect more of the solar rays so that we have less sun coming in and therefore things are not getting as hot as quickly. So that is called solar radiation modification or solar radiation management. You'll hear it said both ways, SRM. And solar radiation modification has several different propositions. One would be that we put something up into space, like a massive space umbrella, basically, that circulates and it reflects the sun's rays back into the atmosphere so that they don't come down into the planet. Another is that we shoot sulfur. There's other things that have been suggested, but we shoot sulfur into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, in such a way that the sulfur reflects the sun's rays back. But we have this thin layer of sulfur in the atmosphere and therefore a slightly grayer sky than we have at present. There's also been suggestions of creating our own albedo effect, unnatural albedo effect. We talked about the fact that the albedo effect of glaciers, ice sheets, permafrost, the tundra, and snowpack are reducing because of the heat from global warming. So some people have suggested, oh, well, we could just like stretch out massive white sheets across the Sahara Desert and use that to push back the solar rays, reflect it back into the atmosphere. Or one thing that has actually been tested recently is that we shoot substances into clouds that make them expand and make them brighter, make the clouds whiter than they used to be, and that the whiteness of the cloud has the albedo effect of shooting the sun's rays back into the atmosphere, or back into space. So there are various ideas for how we could go about modifying the Earth's ability to reflect the sun's rays in unnatural ways. There are many problems with solar radiation modification. Number one is that we don't fully know what kinds of impacts these would have on the Earth and on our ecosystems. Another is that they don't, again, solve the base problem. So if the base problem is carbon emissions, and we are trying to offset that by putting something that reflects the solar rays up into the atmosphere, but we're still pumping carbon up there constantly, that doesn't actually help the carbon problem, and we still get that thicker and thicker atmosphere. So it just kind of kicks the can down the road. It doesn't actually solve the problem. It just pushes it out a little bit. And similarly with the carbon sequestration problem, if something were to go awry, we're not quite sure what that would do. So let's say we shoot some sulfur into the atmosphere. We can't know what that will do until we've already done that. And potentially we might have effects that we didn't bargain for, like that we get too cold here on the planet. Go and check the film Snowpiercer. That's precisely the premise of the film Snowpiercer, is someone's done solar radiation modification by making the atmosphere thicker with sulfur, and that's caused the Earth to basically freeze because we can't get the solar rays in enough. So there's all sorts of worries by the scientific community around solar radiation modification. The biggest concern is that it doesn't actually solve the problem. It just pushes out the limits at, where the problem can then get a little bit more, and we kick it down a little bit more. So it's these are potentially dangerous and don't actually solve anything. All right, so what are our alternatives to solar radiation modification or to carbon sequestration as technological solutions to the problem of climate change? You're very familiar, undoubtedly, with renewable energy, which has many forms. There's rooftop solar that people put on their homes. There's these concentrated solar farms that you see as you drive, out past Prim into Las Vegas, and others. You need to know that these supposedly green forms of energy have an environmental cost. Particularly these large solar arrays, which take up massive tracts of land and which sometimes take up massive tracts of natural desert as well. They, they are better to some extent than coal power plants, but they also have their own toll, not just on the land use, but also in terms of the metals that they require in them. So they require metals that are largely mined in places like the Congo. They are to produce them and create them. It's a highly toxic process. So people who work in these plants have health problems because of the metals that they're dealing with to create these solar panels. And they don't have very long lifespans. So these are not permanent solutions. You have to replace a solar panel after a certain amount of time, and pull out more of those same minerals to be able to, and heavy metals to produce these. So they are greener in the sense that we're not putting carbon into the atmosphere, but they have their own sets of problems. Wind is somewhat better in that regard. Wind power is not as toxic as solar panels. But both solar and wind have the primary problem, as you're very well aware, that they're not always reliable. It's not always sunny, and the wind's not always blowing, so you don't always have a power supply from these, which is one of the major reasons why they're considered a problematic replacement for coal power plants, because coal is always available to burn, whereas solar and wind aren't always. In contrast, geothermal is always available. Geothermal takes the heat from the earth, and particularly pockets that have more intense heat, and uses that to offset temperatures on the surface. So geothermal is persistent, but geothermal is not useful in all environments. Wave is also another way. It's like wind. You take the energy of the waves and capture that in machines that are set offshore, and you can then get energy sources. But just like the wind, waves are sometimes higher, sometimes lower, depending on what the wind is doing. So these are not, except for geothermal, none of these are always and constantly available to us for our power needs. Therefore, they rely on things like batteries, which again require huge input in terms of lithium, in terms of other minerals that are necessary to store that kind of energy. So these are green to a point, and solar in particular, solar farms in particular. Solar on rooftop is much better, but solar farms are particularly problematic as green energy. What is often trashed as not being green, and incorrectly, since we are in a critical thinking class, is nuclear energy. People get really worried that nuclear energy is dangerous, that it is something that will ruin our environment or ruin society. In fact, that's just not true. And yes, there have been very few nuclear disasters around the world, but when you compare the deaths from nuclear disasters, which have been very few, with the deaths from carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants, there's really no comparison. Nuclear is so much healthier, so much safer than coal. And it doesn't have the problem of needing to be replaced constantly the way that solar panels do. Well, not constantly, but every 20 years or so. It's much more permanent than that, and it's a steady supply. So it offsets the need for batteries that solar and wind have. So nuclear is actually a very good source of green energy. And what's exciting about nuclear is that recently there's been a lot of innovation such that we don't have to put in the large old versions of nuclear reactors that take up a lot of space and that are very expensive to build and take years to build. Instead, we have smaller reactors, and there's even mini and micro reactors available that can be shipped on the back of a truck. So you can get 5 years of power to a rural community on with just a truck-sized mini reactor today, given the cool technology that is largely being produced here in California and on the West Coast. So here in El Segundo, we have a micro reactor company that is creating these truck-sized reactors. And there's other companies around California that if they were given free rein and they were given the kind of investment in research that they need, could really innovate with nuclear pretty quickly. So that's the last one was nuclear fission. There's also another form of innovation that's going on in nuclear that's nuclear fusion, which doesn't have any of the radioactive waste that needs to be dealt with nuclear fission, although that waste is very safely contained in the existing technology that we have for that, just to reiterate that nuclear is very safe. But there's this nuclear fusion that is now being developed. It has not yet come to fruition. So here in California, we have seen the first two instances of scientists being able to get more energy out of a nuclear fusion reaction than they put in. But nuclear fusion could potentially be a technology going forward in the future that would be able to power the entire planet, because it's basically like producing the energy of the sun, but in a controlled way that allows you to spread the use of that energy around the world. There are companies across the United States and in some of Europe that are scrambling to get this technology out, but it is not yet available, not yet to a point that we could make it commercially viable. But I just want to put that out there, that there are exciting new forms of energy sources being worked on by scientists today that could help offset both our reliance on not so green things like solar panels, but also definitely replace all of our reliance on fossil fuels, which are killing our planet. So no matter how much solution we come up with in terms of energy, we have to recognize that we have already done massive damage to the earth, both through direct activity and also through the indirect effects of climate change. So in this picture here, you see an area of Canada in Alberta, what it once looked like, and then what it now looks like after it has been mined for tar sands. So in much of Alberta, tar sands companies have gone through, they've scraped the trees and the top layers off the land, and they have taken the soil underneath that is rich with oil, tar sands, and then they squeeze the soil underneath and they pull the oil out of it, and then they send that oil in pipelines down to New Orleans to be refined here in the United States. Again, it's tar sands out of Alberta in Canada, and this is what it looks like. There's large swaths of Alberta that once had the trees that we need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and that we need for a healthy planet and ecosystem to produce clouds and weather patterns and habitat, etc., all the things that forests do. And we've made it look like this in the interest of creating cheaper oil sources. So we have a lot of repair work to do around the world. We need to clean up our messes, and we need to replant and restore the natural ecosystems that existed prior to the direct and indirect destruction that we've caused. So we have to start investing in that for our own good as humans. We need to understand that it is not just pretty, but it is actually part of the living planet that sustains us, and that without that, we continue to die. We will see not only increasing climate disasters, wildfires and hurricanes and floods and heat waves. We'll see not only all of that, but the planet as a whole will continue to collapse and fold in on itself. So we need to put serious effort into rewilding the planet. We need to get human habitation to move in and be denser, rather than humans continuing to constantly move into forested areas or other wilderness areas. And instead, we need to get humans to live closer together, and we need to then put concerted effort into rewilding the tracts of land that we have damaged in a variety of ways. So you might say, okay, that sounds like a lot. It's true. And the people who believe that climate change is a hoax think that it's totally unnecessary, that all of this will sort itself out, that it's either not something that we've caused, or it's not really as big of a problem as scientists make it out to be. They're just being histrionic, they're being kind of silly. But I really like this cartoon. Okay, so what if it was just a big hoax, that climate change was, we addressed it and it wasn't really necessary? What would we get out of it? What this cartoon suggests is we would get energy independence, because we wouldn't have a reliance on oil anymore, much of which comes from around the world. And the prices of oil in Saudi Arabia, from Venezuela, from the Middle East more generally, Iran, those prices will impact us here. Instead, if we had, if we were reliant on nuclear reactors and geothermal power and wind power here, we would be independent of those global controls on oil prices. We would have rainforests preserved. We would be sustainable into the long term. We'd have all these new jobs created around a green economy. We would have these livable cities that are walkable and that don't require cars for all of us to get around. We would have clean water and clean air, because one of the major things that fossil fuels do, as we know, is to ruin our water and ruin our air. So it's not just climate change, it's also those that we can fix and reverse by shifting over to sustainable sources of energy, including nuclear, wind, solar, and especially geothermal in many places around the world. All right, so let's review what we have talked about so far. First of all, I just talked about climate change as a potential hoax on the last page. So how settled is the science on climate change? The answer is, as we've talked about in other videos, it's very, very settled. It's not that scientists dispute this among themselves. There's not a lot of arguing. There are a few anomalous, often called quack, climate scientists who disagree, but 99.99% of the thousands and thousands and thousands of climate scientists around the world are in total agreement about not only that climate change is already here, but that the situation is extremely dire, and that we are headed in a very rapid, very worrying direction. So what impacts are we already seeing? we are seeing an increased number of hurricanes, an increased number of tornadoes, we're seeing an increased number of droughts, we're seeing an increased number of forest fires, we're seeing an increased number of floods. And all of that together is having massive impact on human life. So we're seeing direct deaths, but we're also seeing direct destruction of property and of homes. And then we're also seeing droughts affecting food prices around the world as well. So why is it that focusing on one's own carbon footprint and what you do, what your consumption patterns are, what your behavior is like, why is that actually a very bad use of your time? That's because no matter if all of us were to individually go around being as careful as we could about our own carbon footprints, it would not solve the climate crisis, because the business sector is really where most of the carbon emissions are actually taking place. So it's that area that we need to focus on if we're going to solve our shared problem. And our individual experience of climate change will not be improved if the corporate sector, business sector, industrial sector does not start to change its behavior. So then how do we focus on that? We focus on that by getting politically involved. We join organizations that are working to get politicians to do what they need to do in terms of regulating carbon emissions and methane emissions, and change over our full economy to a sustainable energy system. So join those organizations, fight in that direction at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. That is where you need to put your time in order to make this, in order to be able to solve this problem. What forms of energy are sustainable? Definitely solar, wind, and geothermal, wave are all sustainable, but compared to carbon, they are, coal, they're excellent, but they do have their own, especially solar panels, they do have their own environmental impact that is not wonderful. Nuclear power, on the other hand, is also sustainable, and it has it doesn't have the same kind of impact in terms of mining and in terms of batteries that solar panels have. So nuclear power is, just so you know, very safe, and it is seeing increased innovation recently that brings all sorts of exciting new solutions to the table. Nuclear fusion is not yet available, but if it were, it would solve the last problem of nuclear fission, which is the nuclear toxic waste, which has to be dealt with nuclear power. So those are the options that we have at present, and definitely look up some more about why nuclear is clean energy. There are clubs at campuses around the world called NICE, Nuclear is Clean Energy. Check those out and maybe start a chapter here at CSULB or join a chapter here if there already is one. Okay, so what solutions to global warming are dangerous? Solar radiation modification is highly dangerous, highly controversial. Scientists who look at it think that we'd be crazy to use that as our solution to global warming because it doesn't actually solve the source of the problem, which is carbon emissions. And beyond our shift in energy sources, what else is necessary? Not only do we need to solve our energy problem and get off of fossil fuels, but we need to heal the planet, rewilding. We need to go and clean up the messes that we've made, and we need to restore to the extent that it's possible. We need to restore the forests and the oceans that we have harmed in order for the earth to be healed in a way that it can resume its natural life cycles, resume its natural weather patterns, and start to sustain life as it used to in decades past. Because where we are at right now is that things are getting chaotic in terms of weather, and we are seeing the undermining of the very ecosystems that sustain us. So if we want to continue to live going forward, we need to restore the ecosystems that we have damaged for our own good as well as for the ecosystem's good. Okay, so that is everything for our unit on climate change, and good luck with the exam, and hit me up with all your questions. I'm very excited to talk to you about whatever you want to hear, whatever you want to push back on, whatever you want to dispute. I would love to hear that. So reach out to me and let's have a chat. Bye.